Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a case of parental terror. An infant found unresponsive in a cluttered RV, his body marked with bruises, and a father whose frantic story shifted with every question. What really happened inside that motorhome on a cold Georgia night, and why do the baby's injuries speak louder than the parents' words? Peach County, Georgia, late winter, late January 2022. Fluorescents hum over a Buc-ee's gas station while paramedics bend over an 8-month-old boy who is not breathing right. A mother trembles. A father paces, voice ricocheting off metal and glass, swearing he only dropped the child during a hurried bath, swearing he did what any dad would do. Officers fan out, lock the lanes, and turn toward the family's RV. Inside is heat and clutter, the sour mix of old smoke, spilled formula, and panic. A kitchen sink crowded with dishes, a towel no one can explain. On a tiny leg, a stiff wrap that looks more like a craft project than medicine. The father's words slide and snag. Ground or floor, slipped or fell, warm water or cold. The infant's skin answers with colors plum and umber, green fading to yellow, bruises blooming in different stages. On the forehead, dots like fingertips. On the hands, the map of a squeeze. On the heels, marks that should not be there. Accident. The father insists, voice breaking, anger flaring, then pleading again. Officers trade looks they have learned to hide. A sergeant makes the hospital call. The baby has a pulse. The baby is alive and still. Something is off. When the RV door swings wider, the space feels smaller. There are other children. There are stories that do not fit inside their sentences. There is a past waiting behind this night, like a door you pray stays closed. If this is only bad luck, why does every detail lean toward harm? Why does the makeshift cast feel like a choice, not a mistake? Why do the bruises speak more clearly than either parent? The floodlights flatten everything but the truth. And when investigators push past the noise, past the shouting, the shaking, the promises they will find a pattern that turns panic into cruelty, and cruelty into something far darker. What really happened inside that RV? And why did it take so long for anyone to say it out loud? Before the flashing lights and the frantic shouts at Buc-ee's, there was a man whose past carried shadows far heavier than his words revealed. Christopher Scott Palmer, born in 1981, grew into adulthood already tangled in trouble. Records show a pattern of violence, mostly directed at women and children. In New York, his name was etched into the sex offender registry after a disturbing offense involving minors. Later, in Georgia, family violence charges surfaced, incidents that drew police to his home but rarely kept him there. For years, Palmer walked the line between freedom and incarceration, his anger always burning just beneath the surface. By the time he met Shelley Brooks, the young woman who would become the mother of his children, Palmer was already in his 40s. Shelley, born in 1996, was half his age and carried vulnerabilities of her own. She struggled with cognitive limitations, confirmed later by detectives who asked directly if she had a disability. She admitted that she did life, she said, always felt harder for her to navigate. Monthly disability checks provided her only income. Yet even that, by the accounts of her parents, quickly slipped into Palmer's hands. He controlled the money, the movement, and increasingly, every choice she was allowed to make. Those who crossed paths with the couple noticed the imbalance immediately. Friends described Shelley as battered, withdrawn, a young woman who rarely lifted her eyes to meet another's. Detectives saw the same dynamic. Palmer towering, angry, speaking for her. Shelley quiet, hesitant, her voice often trailing off. She had been punched, locked in rooms, even handcuffed sometimes for punishment. Sometimes, she said, just because Palmer wanted to. Guns were part of the intimidation. He would wave one, fire one into the walls of the RV, or threaten to kill her father if she ever tried to leave. The RV itself was both shelter and trap for Palmer. It symbolized freedom from rules, a place where he could evade warrants and live by his own law. For Shelley, it was a cage. They drifted from stop to stop, holding signs about losing their home in a fire, sometimes telling strangers half-truths that earned them sympathy. Inside the RV, though, chaos reigned. Children living amid clutter and violence, makeshift repairs, substituting for medical care, tension rising each day. Palmer's older children from previous relationships had already seen sides of his temper. His ex, Megan, warned Shelley in text messages, "Be careful. I dealt with a hell of a lot of abuse at his hands. He's the reason I carry a gun." Shelley believed, or wanted to believe, that he had changed. But behind closed doors, his paranoia and drug use, especially methamphetamine, stripped away any illusion of control. This was the backdrop when Cody was born in 2021. An infant's first months should be filled with gentle hands, careful eyes, and warmth. Instead, Cody grew in an environment where bruises became normal, where his cries were silenced with flicks, where a broken leg was wrapped at home instead of treated by doctors. The man who called himself Dad carried not only his baby, but also the weight of his unchecked rage, his addictions, and a history that foretold tragedy. The night of January 30th, 2022, did not begin with blue lights or sirens. It began with small choices inside an RV parked at Buc-ee's, choices that spiraled into tragedy. Inside the motorhome, Christopher Palmer claimed he was preparing to bathe baby Cody in the kitchen sink. The sink, cluttered with dishes, became the stage for his shifting story. That Cody slipped, that he jerked suddenly, that he fell and hit his head. Palmer insisted it was all an accident, but the evidence surrounding that night suggests otherwise. When paramedics arrived, Cody was limp, his tiny body marked with bruises. Some were fresh, dark against his pale skin. Others had already started to fade, proof that this was not a one-time incident. His leg, crudely wrapped in a homemade cast, told a story of a fracture left untreated for weeks. Pediatric experts would later call it a bucket handle fracture, an injury almost never caused by an innocent fall, but rather by violent shaking or deliberate force. To investigators, the injury alone shattered Palmer's claims of a simple accident. Witness accounts from the scene paint a portrait of chaos. Palmer raged, pleaded, cursed, and contradicted himself, swinging between anger and despair. He shouted that police were holding him hostage, that they did not understand. Officers, trained to filter emotion from fact, noted the inconsistencies. The ground or the floor, a slip or a drop, a bruise from play or from punishment. His narrative bent and twisted, unable to fit the injuries in front of them. Even more chilling were the marks on Cody's body. Dots, like fingertip impressions, spread across his forehead. Bruises lined his tiny arms and hands. His heels bore strange wounds, marks that pediatricians later said could only have come from force or burning. These were not the traces of a single night's misfortune. They were the echoes of sustained harm. Shelley Brooks, the mother, offered explanations that fell apart under scrutiny. She repeated Palmer's story, sometimes hesitating, sometimes contradicting herself. She admitted she had wanted to take Cody to the hospital when his leg was hurt, but Palmer forbade it. "Just hush," he told her. "He'll be fine." The RV became both a prison and a clinic of neglect. Each time Shelley thought of seeking help, she said, Palmer's threats, the gun, the violence, the promise to kill her father pulled her back into silence. For the officers on duty, one discovery deepened the dread. This was not Palmer and Shelley's first loss. In 2019, another infant in their care had died under suspicious circumstances. At the time, it was ruled sudden infant death syndrome. But the details, a crib cluttered with weapons, an infant who suffocated during a night that involved Palmer, now cast a haunting shadow over Cody's case. Lightning had struck twice, but investigators began to wonder if it was really lightning at all. In interviews, Palmer demonstrated what he called rescue attempts. He described flipping Cody over, striking his back, pressing his chest, trying to make him cry. He said he wanted to hear noise, any noise, proof of life. Blood and yellow fluid, he claimed, came from Cody's mouth during CPR. But his demonstrations were too forceful, too aggressive, more like violent handling than life-saving aid. Detectives saw what he would not admit, that his supposed rescue might have been another layer of harm. Shelley, in her own words, admitted she had seen Palmer flick the baby's head to silence his cries. She said he sometimes played roughly, tossing the children upside down. She recounted being locked, tied, and controlled her body, bearing its own scars of his temper. Yet even then, she stopped short of blaming him outright. Fear and dependency blurred her voice. I never hurt my baby, she said of herself. I tried to do what I could. But what she could do, investigators reminded her, was not enough to keep Cody safe. By the early hours of February 4th, Cody's struggle ended. After days in the hospital, hooked to machines, his brain injuries proved fatal. At 4:46 in the morning, he was pronounced dead. His cause of death, traumatic brain injury. His age, 8 months. His life, cut short inside a motorhome that was supposed to shelter him, but instead became an RV of horrors. The crime, investigators concluded, was not a momentary lapse. It was a culmination of Palmer's violence, his addiction, his control, and a mother's silence bound by fear. It was written in bruises, in bones that healed without care, in a night that exposed years of neglect. Palmer's rage that evening was not shock at an accident, but panic at being caught. And Cody, voiceless, became the final witness. From the moment police secured the RV at Buc-ee's, the scene became a layered puzzle. Officers cataloged every bruise, every stain, every inconsistency. They interviewed Palmer and Shelley separately, their words folding in on themselves. Detectives quickly realized that the injuries on Cody could not be reconciled with the version of events Palmer offered. His story was riddled with contradictions. A slip in the sink, a fall on the floor, a stumble against the stairs. None explained the bruises in multiple stages of healing or the broken leg wrapped in tape like a do-it-yourself project. Medical professionals gave detectives language for what they already suspected: a bucket handle fracture, fingertip bruises, injuries consistent with shaking, squeezing, or impact not with the accidents Palmer described. And then there was the baby's head trauma, too severe to be explained by a single fall. Each report that arrived from the hospital strengthened the case. This was not neglect alone, but abuse. Detectives also pulled the threads of Palmer's past. In Brantley County, in 2019, another infant in the household had died under questionable circumstances. Back then, investigators accepted sudden infant death syndrome as the cause, but with Cody's injuries in front of them, they began to view that earlier tragedy through darker lenses. This was a man with history, violence toward women, registered sex offenses, and charges of family violence. Now an infant under his care lay dying in a hospital bed. The investigators also uncovered the family dynamic. Shelley, though legally an adult, had the vulnerability of someone less equipped to resist. She admitted Palmer controlled her disability income, her movements, and even her voice. Police began to view her not only as a suspect, but also as a possible victim, trapped in a cycle of fear and dependence. Yet, the law demanded accountability. She had known her baby was injured and still failed to act. Both parents were arrested: Palmer for cruelty to children and aggravated assault, Shelley for first-degree cruelty and neglect. In custody, Palmer's temper swung wildly. He shouted that police were framing him, that they were holding him against his will. He threatened self-harm, pleaded to see his children, then erupted in anger again. Detectives recognized the volatility of an abuser confronted by limits he could no longer control. Shelley, on the other hand, broke more quietly. She confessed to being beaten, threatened with guns, even drugged with methamphetamine without consent. Her words painted a portrait of a young woman battered into compliance. Still, investigators charged her, pointing out that fear did not absolve her from failing to protect her children. The final charges against Palmer grew heavier as Cody's condition worsened. When the baby died on February 4, 2022, prosecutors added felony murder and malice murder to the list. With each development, the RV transformed further in the eyes of the public, no longer a home, but a crime scene, a place where innocence had been extinguished. The community's shock was immediate. Media reports detailed the horror: an 8-month-old beaten, broken, and left to die in a cluttered camper. The phrase RV of horrors began to circulate, capturing the sense that what investigators found inside went beyond neglect. It was cruelty, sustained and deliberate. By the time Palmer stood before a judge, the list of charges was a ledger of brutality: first-degree cruelty to children, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, felony murder, and malice murder. For the officers who first arrived at Buc-ee's that night, the memory of Cody's tiny body lingered. The questions had been answered, at least legally. Palmer's rage and Shelley's silence converged to create the conditions that killed him, but the emotional weight remained, a reminder that even the most ordinary places, a gas station, a family's camper, can conceal crimes of devastating magnitude. When Christopher Palmer finally entered the courtroom, the quiet of the RV was replaced with the weight of justice. The trial unfolded in late November 2024 in Peach County, Georgia. For jurors, the evidence was as haunting as it was overwhelming. Photographs of Cody's battered body, testimony from doctors about fractures and bruises, and hours of police footage capturing Palmer's volatility on the night of the incident. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. Pediatric specialists explained that Cody's leg fracture was not consistent with the story of an older sibling jumping in a playpen. Instead, they described it as a classic indicator of child abuse, caused by violent twisting or shaking. Photographs of fingertip-shaped bruises on Cody's head and arms reinforced that conclusion. Then came the testimony about the traumatic brain injury, the blow that ultimately ended his short life. This was not an accident. One medical examiner testified, this was inflicted. Prosecutors also brought Palmer's past into the light. They detailed his record of family violence, his presence on the sex offender registry, and his history of controlling Shelley with intimidation and fear. They reminded the jury that another infant in his care had died in 2019, under suspicious but unproven circumstances. While the defense objected to some of this evidence as prejudicial, the judge allowed key details to demonstrate a pattern of violence and neglect. The defense attempted to paint Palmer as a panicked father. They argued that he had tried to revive Cody with CPR, that the injuries were consistent with desperate rescue efforts gone wrong. They emphasized the chaos of that night, the confusion, the exhaustion. Shelley's statements, sometimes contradictory, gave them fragments to cling to. But each time the defense suggested accident, the prosecution countered with medical fact. The bruises were in different stages of healing. The leg fracture had been left untreated for weeks. No reasonable jury could call that desperation. It was cruelty. Shelley's fate diverged from Palmer's. Declared incompetent to stand trial due to cognitive limitations, she was removed from direct prosecution. For some, this decision was controversial. She had failed to protect her son, yet the court recognized her vulnerability. Instead, Palmer bore the full weight of the charges. He faced counts of first-degree cruelty to children, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, felony murder, and malice murder. The jury deliberated for only an hour and a half. In that short span, they agreed unanimously, guilty on all charges. The swiftness of their decision reflected not only the strength of the evidence, but also the clarity of the narrative. Cody had been failed, and Christopher Palmer was responsible. The judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 additional years. Palmer showed flashes of anger even as the verdict was read. His defiance unchanged, but the courtroom no longer bent to his voice. For the jurors, the trial was not only about law, but about morality. In their hands had been the story of a voiceless child, and their verdict was a declaration that his suffering mattered. For the community, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though not comfort. Justice had spoken, but Cody was still gone. Behind every brutal crime lies a landscape of the mind, motives, impulses, and patterns that reveal why harm was inflicted. In Christopher Palmer's case, psychology offers a window into the forces that turned a father into a predator within his own home. Palmer's history already hinted at instability. Violence was a recurring language for him, against women, against children, against anyone who threatened his control. Psychologists often describe this as coercive dominance, the need to maintain absolute power through intimidation and fear. Palmer embodied it fully. He dictated Shelley's finances, isolated her from her family, and enforced obedience with fists, handcuffs, and guns. To the outside world, his volatility seemed like chaos. Inside the RV, it was strategy. Keep everyone off balance, too afraid to resist. Substance abuse added another layer. Methamphetamine is notorious for amplifying paranoia, aggression, and impulsivity. Shelley recounted being forced to ingest it, and investigators learned Palmer used it almost daily. In such states, abusers often swing between manic energy and explosive violence, blurring any boundary between discipline, play, and cruelty. When Palmer claimed he flicked Cody's head or shook him during play, the psychology of meth-driven aggression explains how he could justify brutality to himself as something casual or harmless. Palmer also displayed traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder: disregard for rules, lack of remorse, and manipulation of others. His shifting stories to police slip, fall, accident were not just lies, but rehearsed survival tactics. Even in custody, he shouted, wept, and pleaded in cycles, performing emotions that might win sympathy. What he lacked was genuine accountability. Instead, his anger revealed the deeper truth. Palmer's greatest fear was not Cody's suffering, but his own exposure. For Shelley, psychology complicates the narrative. She was not the aggressor, but she was not an active protector either. Investigators recognized the hallmarks of battered woman syndrome: learned helplessness, fear of retaliation, dependence reinforced by economic and emotional control. She admitted to being beaten, locked up, even drugged. To an outsider, her inaction seemed unforgivable, but trauma studies show how cycles of abuse erode a victim's agency. Her silence, tragic as it was, came from a place of survival. The law could not fully excuse her, but psychology explains why she stayed and why she obeyed. Cody's case also highlights intergenerational trauma. Children raised in violent homes often become trapped in repeating cycles. Older siblings bruised from rough handling, a baby fatally injured, and a mother unable to intervene. The RV was not just a crime scene. It was a closed ecosystem of fear, where violence was normalized day after day. By the time police intervened, those psychological dynamics had hardened into inevitability. In court, experts framed Palmer as dangerous, not only for what he had done, but for what he could do again. His pattern of domination, his addiction, and his inability to accept responsibility made him a continuing threat. A life sentence without parole was not only punishment, but also protection, shielding others from the violence that had already claimed one child's life. Ultimately, the psychology of the case underscores a chilling reality. Palmer did not suddenly snap. He escalated. Each flick, each threat, each ignored injury was a rehearsal for the night Cody died. Abuse is rarely a single act. It is a pattern that grows until it consumes everything. In Palmer's RV, fear was the law, and psychology explains why no one inside could stop what was coming. When the verdict was read and Christopher Palmer was led away in shackles, a measure of justice was served. But in Peach County and beyond, the echoes of Cody's death lingered. Communities across Georgia followed the case closely, horrified by the details emerging from the RV. Many asked how a child could live in such conditions without intervention, how warning signs, bruises, untreated fractures, erratic behavior could have gone unnoticed until it was too late. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Media outlets labeled the motorhome the RV of horrors, a phrase that captured both the squalor and the cruelty revealed inside. For many, Palmer became the embodiment of a predator, hiding in plain sight, not a stranger in the shadows, but a father entrusted with life who instead delivered death. Online forums, comment sections, and community meetings filled with anger and grief, calling for stronger child welfare oversight and harsher penalties for repeat offenders. For law enforcement, the case became a sobering example of persistence. Officers who had worked that January night spoke candidly about the toll it took. Some admitted breaking down afterward, haunted by the sight of an 8-month-old struggling for breath, covered in bruises. Evil exists, one officer said in a televised interview, and our job is to confront it before it claims more lives. Their words resonated widely, reminding the public of both the fragility of children and the limits of policing when abuse hides behind closed doors. Shelley Brooks's fate also drew attention. Declared incompetent to stand trial, she was placed in care rather than prison. Advocates for domestic abuse survivors pointed to her case as an example of how abusers weaponize control. While critics argued she bore responsibility for failing to protect her children, the debate deepened conversations about accountability, victimization, and the thin line between complicit silence and coerced survival. Cody's surviving siblings were placed in foster care, where reports said they remained together. For them, the aftermath was not a headline, but a childhood redefined by loss. They would grow up carrying the shadow of a brother who never had the chance to grow at all. In the end, Palmer's life sentence ensured he would never harm another child again. Yet justice, though delivered, felt incomplete. A child's life had been lost, and no prison term could restore it. The case left a scar on the community, a reminder that vigilance is collective, that silence can be deadly, and that monsters are not always strangers at the door. Sometimes, they sit in the driver's seat of an RV, calling themselves Dad. In reflecting on this case, one painful truth stands out. Evil does not always come from strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes, it hides inside the walls of a home, behind the wheel of an RV, or in the hands of someone who should have been a protector. Baby Cody's short life reminds us that silence and fear can be as deadly as violence itself. Every bruise left unseen, every cry ignored, becomes part of a tragic pattern that ends far too soon. This story challenges us to think about responsibility. How can neighbors, relatives, or even strangers step in when warning signs are clear? In a country as vast as the United States, with millions of children growing up in households marked by instability, vigilance is not just the duty of law enforcement. It is a duty we all share as a community. As you watch, I invite you to reflect. What would you have done if you had seen this family at that Georgia gas station? Would you have noticed the signs? Could you have spoken up? Your thoughts matter, because conversations like these help prevent the next tragedy. If this case has moved you, please leave a comment with your perspective. Share this video to spread awareness. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering the stories that must be told. Together, we can make sure voices like Cody's are never silenced again.